Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be showing you how to complete Zekvir's Lair on the highest difficulty, tier ? This video will be from the point of view of a balanced druid, but hopefully there are some tips and tricks in here for you regardless of which spec you choose to complete this challenge. Let's start with actually unlocking the highest difficulty of Zekvir's Lair first. You'll need to have completed a regular delve in Kazelgar on tier 10 or higher, with revives remaining at the end of the run. Personally, I chose Fungal Folly for this as it's fairly quick, but Mycomancer Cavern works just as well. Once you've completed the tier 10 delve, you can head to Zekvir's Lair in the City of Threads, which is at the coordinates 3376 in Ajkahet, and the second difficulty should be available for you. Before we get started with the actual encounter itself, I wanted to highlight some of the main things I did to best prepare myself for this challenge. Starting off, as you can see, I ran this challenge as a balanced druid at item level 614, so not the highest item level I could have been, and not with the best pieces of gear either. The main things I did with my gear were to make sure as many pieces as possible were enchanted with my Bis enchants, and then I also used this Imperfect Ascendancy Serum during my burst windows. As you can see, it's item level 610 and sitting in the champion track, so it's not even fully upgraded, and it's certainly not necessarily Bis, but the use of this trinket was certainly nice as a nice increase of intellect during my cooldowns. Now we can take a quick look at the consumables I used, starting off with the Feast of the Divine Day. I think probably across the board this will be definitely high up on the list for any class and spec, as it's currently the best stat food that we have. In terms of a flask, I had the option of doing either the Flask of Alchemical Chaos or the Flask of Tempered Mastery. In the end I went for the Flask of Alchemical Chaos just as it sims slightly better and is Bis for Moonkin. You may find that something else is Bis for your class and spec. In terms of a mana oil, I used the Algari mana oil for crit strike and haste. And lastly, I wanted to highlight my Dreambound Augment rune, which I did run for this challenge even though this Augment rune comes from Dragonflight, so is somewhat outdated. I personally didn't want to spend the gold on the current content Augment rune, and I managed the challenge just fine without it, so it just kind of goes to show that you don't need all of the best consumables to complete this challenge. Now in terms of during combat, I did also run the Algari healing potion. I made these myself at rank 2 and they did perfectly fine. And then I also used a rank 3 tempered potion as my combat potion, but I held this for phase 2. Now we can take a look at the talent build that I ran. Now if you are running this as a balanced druid and you would like to use this exact talent loadout, I have the import string listed in the description below for you. But I do have a couple of tips and tricks for you regardless of your class and spec. Starting off, you want to lean as single target heavy as possible for Zekvir's Lair. This is because throughout the fight you should only ever be single targeting the boss or the eggs that spawn during the fight, so there's no need to spec into any AoE talents if you can avoid them. As you can see, I specced out of any Starfall talents as well as Twin Moons, which causes Moonfire to strike more than one target at a time if they're close enough, and I also ran Convoke the Spirits, which is a nice single target talent to have as well. Next up, it's super useful to remember that Zekvir will only ever cast his heal mechanic as often as the player can feasibly interrupt it. With that in mind, you should always have an interrupt available for every heal cast, unless you use it by mistake. That means there's actually no need to spec into an additional silence if you have one. As you can see, I have Skull Bash, but I didn't use it. And there's also not necessarily any need to spec into talents that will reduce your interrupts cooldown. For example, Light of the Sun. At least in my experience as a balanced druid, specking out of Skull Bash and out of Light of the Sun essentially forced Zekvir to only ever cast his interruptible heal once every minute whenever I had Solar Beam available. Another useful thing to note is that if an egg hatches, the spider can be CC'd by the likes of Polymorph and Hibernate, so definitely spec into some CC if you have it, as this can help you interrupt the spider's web blast without using your actual interrupt. Personally, I also found it very beneficial to lean slightly more defensively in my build, and this was because I didn't necessarily find my damage against the boss to be an issue. so I had the freedom to use some talent points elsewhere to help me to survive. So I took an increased duration of Bark Skin, I also took some extra healing from Bark Skin and from Frenzied Regen. I also decided to spec into Killer Instinct for some increased armor, as well as matted fur. Now, while most of Zekvir's mechanics are avoidable damage, if you do get hit by them, they are usually a one-shot. But I found that I was taking a lot of damage just from Zekvir's melee attacks, especially when I didn't have Brann's health potions to help me heal. Having the extra defensives went a long way. I also wanted to highlight the dispels needed throughout this fight, and it's highly recommended that you grab something that can deal with the enfeebling spittle mechanic, as Brann won't always be able to help. Be mindful that enfeebling spittle is a magic effect that also involves a movement speed reduction, meaning it can be shapeshifted out of if you're a druid. Or another example is that mages can talent into energized barriers in their class tree, which allows their barriers to remove snares. Doing so will remove the debuff entirely and negate the mechanic. Lastly, I wanted to highlight that movement is an incredibly important part of this encounter, as Zekvir has a lot of AoE avoidable damage. Obviously, as a druid I have quite an easy time avoiding mechanics like that, as I have Stampeding Roar, I have Dash, and I also spec'd into Wild Charge, but definitely try to spec into some extra movement if you're struggling to deal with these mechanics. In terms of my Brann, I ran this challenge with Brann at level 33 and set to the healer role. In terms of the combat and utility curios, I tried pretty much every combination, and personally I landed on the Porcelain Arrowhead idol. I liked this one because it was a nice set of guaranteed damage against Zekvir and I didn't have to do anything special to proc it during the encounter. And in terms of the utility curio, I ran the Amorphous Relic. This one offers one of two very useful buffs, but the main one I actually liked the most was Miniature, mostly for the 20% movement speed, just in moments where I didn't necessarily have a movement talent to help me in sticky situations. You may find that other curios work better for you and your class or spec and or your playstyle, but in terms of other combat curios I would run, you could definitely try the Light Touched Idol if you're struggling with survivability, and the same with the Idol of the Earth Mother. Certain curios to avoid in my opinion are the Idol of Final Will. This one in particular because it will require you throughout the fight to aim your character towards Zekvir, and sometimes you may not be in a position to do so, so you may just find that that particular curio doesn't really give you much value. Another curio to avoid in my opinion is the Brute Force Idol. This one will take away player control when Brann throws you at the boss for a few seconds. This could put you in a dangerous situation, such as the boss about to finish casting a frontal or the AoE Fear, for example. In terms of utility curios to avoid, I would honestly say to avoid most of them, with the exception of the Amorphous Relic or the Relic of Sentience. This one in particular is nice for some extra healing if you're unable to heal yourself. The Lifeless Necrotic Relic doesn't prevent all lethal damage. For example, if you get hit by the frontal, it won't proc, it will just kill you. And if the relic does proc, you can't be healed. So this is kind of a no-go in all areas for me. Relic Blood of Zekvir was too risky in my opinion because it reduces player HP, and personally I found that Zekvir's melee damage was hitting me hard enough without the reduced HP, so I avoided this one altogether. In terms of the Streamlined Relic, this one only really gives you any combat benefit at the very start of combat. As you can see, you proc some extra haste for 8 seconds, but after that you remain in combat and don't get any more benefit from this relic, so I avoided this one too. The Time Lost Relic seemed like a nice idea for some extra haste and movement speed, but it does require you to stand in a specific spot throughout the fight, and that can't always be guaranteed, because you quite often need to be moving around to dodge mechanics or to get on top of your egg. Lastly, the Olden Seeker Relic is a complete write-off for me, as this one focuses on gathering, and there is nothing to gather in Zekvir's Lair. Now we're ready to start the encounter. As a ranged DPS, I pulled the boss as far across the room as possible to maximize my damage against him and minimize his damage against me. I also popped my cooldowns on the pull with my trinket, but I'm saving my combat potion until phase 2, and I'm holding my trees until the first ad spawns. As you can see, I'm staying fairly close to the boss for the most part to give myself an easier time of dodging the claw smash frontal. A useful tip for maximizing uptime is to try and interrupt the regenerating carapace heal as late as possible. Of course, if the interrupts are a big issue for you, get them out of the way as soon as possible. But keeping the boss casting for as long as possible allows you to stay safe from extra damage and stay focused on DPSing the boss.
Fear incoming. Frontal.
When an ad is about to spawn, you can see where it will be by the web animation floating across the room. And as you can see, I instantly hard swap to it and use my trees. Because of my hero talents, my trees will moonfire the egg for me and save me a GCD so I can get the ad down as quickly as possible. There's no need to try and damage the boss when there is an ad. Pretty soon after the ad, the boss casts Enfeebling Spittle. Usually, Brann will dispel the first cast. If you can, get rid of the debuff as quickly as possible so you don't have to deal with being slowed or take unnecessary damage.
Collapse. Frontal.
I have Celestial Alignment and Convoke the Spirits back up for the third ad, and I use both to nuke the ad as quickly as possible, while also getting some extra damage in on Zekvir before he enters a short intermission where he takes 99% reduced damage. You can see that I was able to get almost 6% extra boss damage in before he enters Phase 2, which was super useful. In Phase 2, Zekvir will now also channel Unending Spines, which are swirlies you need to dodge, and the AoE Fear will now also shoot out 4 orbs in a square formation for you to dodge as well. Both of these mechanics were a one-shot in my experience, so do be very careful.
Interrupt. Frontal. Watch your step. Fear incoming. Watch your step. Collapse. Fear incoming. Watch your step.
It's supposedly part of the fight that Brann hits 1 HP in Phase 2 and is left unconscious for 30 seconds, meaning the player is left to heal and dispel themselves on their own and do their best to survive. Personally, I found that during most of those 30 seconds, Zekvir casted his abilities back to back, which meant I didn't need much healing and I was able to dispel myself without fail, so this wasn't a huge issue for me.
Frontal. Fear incoming. Watch your step. Frontal.
As you get closer to defeating Zekvir, just stay calm and focus on the mechanics, as you don't want to hard focus the boss too early and end up being overrun before you can finish the fight. DBM was super handy for me so I could have callouts during the encounter, as well as timers for each ability so I could preempt any movement or cooldowns I needed to use.
Watch your step. Fear incoming. Frontal.
So there we have it. That is my guide on how to defeat Zekvir's Lair on tier ? As always, if you have any questions or advice of your own that you'd like to share for this challenge, please feel free to leave a comment down below. For now though, I wish you a wonderful rest of your day, and I hope to see you again very soon. Bye!